Okay. Call to order. Finance Committee meeting. All right, motion to approve the agenda.
Need the gavel?
Yeah.
8 o'clock yet?
Huh?
8 o'clock yet?
8 o'clock. That's great.
Would you run to this show?
Yeah. So a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Seconded.
All right, any discussion? All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye, okay. Agenda is approved. Move on to the 5-year financing plan update. Morning, thank you. Sally. Sally, you gonna start us off or we're gonna go right there? Okay, morning, Courtney.
Good morning, good morning.
Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. We're going to talk about the 5-year plan today, which is our tool for ensuring that we're in compliance with the board's financial policies for cash balances, bond covenants, and it will predict our future need for borrowing. So Mr. Courtney Rogers from Davenport is kind enough to grace us with his presence this morning and will walk us through the updated plan.
Always great to see everybody and to be here. I know in the past, my partner, we've kind of, scheduling wise, it depends on where we are. And so my partner, David Rose, and I are pleased to be back in front of you again. We've been working with the authority going back 30 plus years. And so it's great to see things continuing on. And as I know over the last couple of years, saw the plan, the future plan with some big numbers starting to pop in. And so this one to me was particularly going to be interesting following, of course, the rate study you all had done recently too. So with that, I'll jump in. Some of this, of course, you've seen, but I'll just kind of go back through it to remind folks who may not have seen this in the past. And the magic clicker does. I break everything. There we go. If he wants to do it, got to manhandle it a little bit, I guess. Sorry. I want to break it. All right. So again, the 5-year plan, what is it? So it includes operating revenues and expenditures, of course, using the latest data that we pulled from the rate study. So we didn't try to recreate the wheel there. It does take into account, of course, availability charges, those revenues and the growth projections, which we'll get into. Incorporates cost estimates and most importantly, the capital projects that are adopted for the 25 to 29 time period. We also have the basis for the cash balances. We want to make sure the two key drivers are coverage and cash. We want to make sure that we're analyzing that and also looking out at potentially any future borrowings that might need to supplement any of the cash to keep the cash levels to where we want them to be. Of course, the way the system works together is the CIP, the operating budget, and rates, including both user charges and availability charges, all go into the mix to eventually come into the plan of finance, which leads us to potentially a bond issue at some point, or just continue along the path of using our cash. So considerations, of course, as I mentioned, Stantec did the 3-year rate study that was recommended back in December. Again, we are using those projections for the rate study, so we didn't try to recreate the wheel from that standpoint. And then the 5-year plan covers 25 to 29. I think the big thing here is this is one of the larger increases we've seen in some time, and the total from last year's 5-year plan to this year's 5-year plan increased by $200 million. So it's not an insignificant number there. The growth ERC estimates remain conservative and are in line with the county projections. The increases are really due to the cost estimates, and we're seeing that across our client base. Bids are coming in higher. The dollars for these larger projects are getting higher and higher. So you've got the DC water improvements, the Broad Run waste, the WRF Phase 3, the reservoir, and then the JOMA expansion. So engineering has looked at the CIP to make sure that, of course, you've got mission critical projects involved. There is the ability to defer some of the smaller ones in case some of them come in a little higher than even projections. So flipping over and looking at where we saw some potential bond issues out there, or actually first, before we get into that, this is the data issuances. I was going back and forth between the numbers in my head. It's almost the same number for each of the 3 years. So we're looking at about 70 million in 27. So basically a couple years out. 70 million in 28, and then finally 60 in 29. Now, the way that things have worked over the last several years is that while we've seen these bond issues, if our conservative estimates, if numbers come in a little bit better, we've been able to either reduce this number or even shift it out further. I suspect that'll happen here again, of course, if things continue along the pace that you've seen over the last several years. But the biggest difference is in the previous plans, we've only had one bond issue. Now we're up to 3. So I suspect there may be a bond issuance in our future at some point down the road. It'll be yet to be determined, of course, and it all is going to be dependent upon the connection fees, the availability charges, things like that are coming in. So just want to also note that additional direct, impacts this, any additional debt directly impacts the user rates, of course, because user rates are going to cover 100% of interest and 30% of principal. So to the point that we can delay doing bond issues, that of course helps us on the rate side. And of course, the way we do that is with additional cash levels coming in over and above our projections.
Courtney, I have a quick question.
Shoot.
Is there any kind of rule of thumb, like we go, all right, we do a $50 million bond issuance, and for every 50 million, it's something like this to the average user rate, or a 10 million, or
Yeah, I
no kind of rule of thumb, or is that too?
Not off the top, not that I can say off the top of my head. Let me say that I've gotten a point now where I don't even run the numbers anymore. That you'd think that I'd have like a base for every 50 million, you're going to increase a certain number, and then we'd have to, of course, calculate it based on the 30% and 100%. I don't have that. I
Okay.
apologize, but no.
Then, Courtney, there's a follow-up to that. How do we adjust for things that maybe are not known, like DC water expansion? There's nothing we knew about that. JLMA kind of came in, some of the surprise. How do you adjust for those kind of unknowns? Maybe they're known unknowns, but
Well, that's really the unknown, the real, I guess, factor there is our cash. That's why we've, from the beginning, set our policies higher than maybe what I'll say a non-growth utility might be. 2 to 3%,
Mhm.
that range that we've used has set us well over the years. I mean, it's, your growth has not slowed down. It seems like we're always going to say, okay, at what point does we start seeing that slow down? It hasn't. And so that's what that 200% drives. I would say, to give, maybe this helps you, a non-growth utility might be at 270 to 365 days, 360,
Mhm.
roughly a year, maybe 3/4 of a year for someone who's not growing. You're twice that and then some.
I see.
And so that's really your cushion for that potential bump the wrong way
Yeah, right.
that helps guide us,
Okay.
because we would have some time to get our numbers back up. And maybe it'll be helpful later in the presentation. We're going to show you how you compare to other AAA utilities.
Mhm.
And maybe that'll help you see where you stand too.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Good question. So looking on page 5 here. So now looking at some additional considerations, of course, one of the things that Ranks has told us several years back was that they did have a concern about our reliability on availability charges. So with that, we decided to put in place a guideline back in 2018 to maintain coverage at least 1 times without including availability charges to debt service requirements. And so that one is doing very well, strongly at 2.3 to 331 during the 5-year period. And then, of course, once we do factor in those availability charges, especially with the strength we've seen recently with some of the data center numbers, they're now at 4.5 and 559 during that period. And again, we'll see some comparisons, how you look versus others along those lines as well here in a little bit.
Just another question on that, and if I read this correctly, Fitch is still saying is dependence on availability charges, even though we're kind of past that point with the other 2 rating agencies.
Yeah, they do. I mean, everybody has their own opinions, right?
Yeah.
And so Fitch is still saying that. I mean, I think they see, and let me say this, if this helps, of course, I work with the county as well. Fitch was the one of the 3 way back in the early 2000s when the county got its first AAA. Fitch was concerned about the rate of growth, because not just it was how fast it was coming, and then what they've seen in their history where it falls once it starts slowing down. All of a sudden, you've had all those dollars coming in. What do you do then? Because you still have the services you got to provide down the road. And so I think maybe that's part of their corporate mindset
Okay.
is a concern that when the spigot turns off, sorry for the pun, water comes up a little bit. Where's that dollar, where the dollar is going to come from to take care of those additional capital needs that you still got to put in place or in the process of putting in place for that growth that's been coming.
Okay.
So it's in keeping with our practice, of course, you had the 3-year rate study look here recently. Of course, the model projects further than that, and that's what we used here in our 5-year plan. Of course, the one thing that was a little bit different was that they did had recommendations for 7% increases for 3 years and then 4% after that. You know, in our discussions with them, I talked with the consultant directly just to kind of get my feel for what they were seeing in the model and rates and whatnot. And it sounded like a lot of that was catch up for just frankly the inflation that we've all seen in the early, I guess, 2020 timeframe, 2021 and 22. It's really trying to play a little bit of catch up, not necessarily anything related to capital per se. And I'm starting to see this in other places too. We've done a couple of recent transactions. Part of it has to do with the size of the needs in terms of your average increase of a plant has gone up in terms of what it's costing to build these plants. And so the old 3% to kind of keep up with inflation we've seen it bump up to 4 and 5%. So I think that's what you're seeing here is that 7 is really because we weren't doing 4 and 5 maybe before that. So again, the user adjustments here, just as we just talked about, 7% the next 3 years, 4% thereafter.
According, real quick, the 4% thereafter, which would be, because we've got our 7% rate increases were last year and then this year and then next year. So we got our 3 years. But then we've got this potential debt issuance here of 70, 70 and 60 in 27, 28, 29.
Right.
So presumably that would mean 4% is not 4% and it's increasing, or is that?
They had the bond issues in the model too, because they projected seeing those rate levels getting below the 200, or not rate levels, cash levels getting below the 200%.
Okay.
So they did have, I don't remember if they were exact. We didn't go back and look exactly and see what they were projecting to see if they were exact, but they would have projected that because they would have seen the same drop based on the CIP. Because I know when we talked about it, the CIP was in there for those, it just wasn't showing up in the 5-year horizon last year.
It had about a $200 million issuance in the next 5 years. I think kind of the timing is what fluctuates in the size of each individual issuance, but the rates that they proposed included a $200 bond issuance somewhere in the next 5 years.
So if we end up doing those 3, it doesn't necessarily mean the 4% user rate increase is going to be 5 or 6 or 7.
Correct.
Right. Plus, we consulted with them on the interest rate assumptions, which is conservative, of course, and hopefully if rates, stay in, right now we're in good shape rate wise. We did there's a little bit backloaded 30-year utility that's much lower rated. So you'd have a much better interest rate, and they were right at 4.5%. So the 5% is not necessarily out of the realm of, we're really being too conservative at this point. They were A-rated that had the AA insurance, so they weren't too far off of AAA.
Okay.
But it was backloaded because they had their debt load. We were trying to wrap around, and we were 5 years. We delayed principal 5 years, so it was really a 25-year amortization on a 30-year final maturity.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So again, as we talked about some of the comparatives, as we look at our neighbors. In terms of the water bill, you're really, I'd say, kind of somewhat in the middle and at the lower end on the sewer side. So at least competitively, you're very, very competitive versus others in the area. On the availability charge, of course, that's tied more to the capital plan. We're seeing a little bit more on the sewer side too, because that's where we're seeing some of the capital, of course. And that's in the 10, I'll call it the 8 to 9, 10% range. Rounding there, and then on 5% to 4, the low 4s there on the water side. And that's something we're seeing across not only the state, but also around the country as well. We're seeing those availability charges being looked at to make sure you're keeping up with the cost that it's the capital cost of adding those additional new homes and buildings and businesses. When you look at the comparison, you can see we're up on the right-hand side there. We go from, we jump over Herndon in terms of at least where the absolute numbers are approaching 20,000 per new I'll call it, average connection on a smaller, on the 5/8 connection there. I suspect you're going to see folks like the Spotsylvanias also keeping up. You're going to see other places that, as you can see, Fairfax is already projecting an increase. Some of the smaller systems that we're working with in other parts of the state, we're seeing the same thing. I've got one smaller system that's been 20,000 since I think in 2006 or so. So you're not alone out there. And even though obviously you see more pressure up here in Northern Virginia, we're seeing it all over the state as well.
Is that consistent with some of the other larger systems like down in Newport News or Richmond or something like that?
So Richmond's a little bit different because it's an older system. I live in Richmond. We don't have and I work with the utility as well. We don't have the same level of new connections. So you don't have the pressure of adding to the plant.
Okay.
They've got sufficient capacity both at the water and wastewater. In fact, they'd actually like to have more people and are always talking to the neighbors. You sure you don't need some more water? Because they do have a lot of capacity, but their growth is not there. It's more, the growth that we see in Richmond is more tear down and rebuild than it is adding. It's at least city proper from that standpoint. And they don't get any connection charges outside the city except on their gas system. They're a little different because they have gas in addition to water, wastewater from a credit standpoint. But I will say this, I also work in the state of Georgia, which has a lot of growth similar to Northern Virginia. In fact, I saw on the news this morning, they announced the big EV plant down there, $7.5 billion plant near Savannah, did its grand opening. They've been rolling cars off now for a few months, but I work with all the localities in that area. They have a lot of pressure on connection charges. They're only talking about getting up to around 15,000. Of course, costs are a little bit different down there. Their cost of living is a little different than this area, but they're seeing that same pressure in that kind of 15,000 per new home connection for a place that's starting to experience pretty rapid growth.
Great. That's helpful.
So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you.
We thought just we'd hit on the, we do continue to monitor the debt issues that we do have out there. We were able to go out and do a refinancing. Of course, as you may remember, in 2017 with the federal tax cuts, they did do away with advance refunding. So we have to wait till we're within 90 days of the call date to do a refinancing. And so the old 2015 bonds, we were coming up on that 10-year and we're able to go out and refinance in the fall last year. And so essentially we were able to squeeze out $8 million of savings. Most of that happens in 28 and beyond. The rate study, I think, was done, if I remember right, at that point. So that'll be factored in as we move forward on the, we factored it in here from our standpoint, but as far as your rates go, that'll be factored in when you take a look at your next 3-year analysis. You can see that's almost $500,000 a year. So it is real money. It is worth the time and effort to go through it. And we were able to lower the interest rates. So that's always helpful.
Really just curious, who are some of the larger buyers of our bonds?
Well,
Any are they just scattered?
yeah, it's still scattered.
Okay.
Insurance companies, and they
Okay.
tend to want a lower coupon and they're buy and hold. They basically put in their portfolio, forget about it. But then you've got other bond funds. A lot of the, the T. Rowe Prices and folks like that who run these big, large funds. Some of them are Virginia state funds. Some of them are just national funds who are who basically do for your mom and pop, your ourselves as investors who might invest in an actual fund rather than go out and buy the bonds individually.
Yeah.
So, and there's still some individuals, banks still play.
Mhm.
And then you've got some of the shorter term players who will come in and buy and try to time the market.
Yeah, okay.
So we still enjoy the highest credit ratings possible. It's still, I'll say that the fraternity has not grown much in terms of the numbers. It's a small fraternity, and you'll see that on their charts, some of the national names that we look at. So again, our policies really are tied around a couple of places, the cash balances, the debt service coverage, and of course, our capital plan, just trying to keep our cash going toward capital as much as possible to, again, try to keep the pressure off number 2, the debt service side, in terms of the coverage. So it's really a balancing act, if you will. So going back to, of course, as a part of that refinancing, we did talk to the rating agencies, and some of the strength they talked about was the seasoned management, Even with the change in management, we still got a good score there. And part of that was just doing part of the way you guys do succession planning and so on. But they also look at the fact that you are staying within your long range goals, that you stay within your policies. You know, the policies we don't bounce around. You know, we've set policies many years ago and we haven't made lots of changes to them. So those are things that are important when it comes to talking about management. Of course, the service area speaks for itself. The fluency of the county is big. And then when we show them the comparisons to the other local rates, they see that they're very affordable, especially given your income levels. So again, governance, you know, you don't have another board behind you having to approve your rates. So that's important when it comes to governance. And that's something that we sometimes take for granted, but is something that is important. And then, of course, credit challenges. They do see our debt burden. It's, believe it or not, it's higher than most, but you're growing faster than most too, when it comes to some of the other AAAs. In terms of, believe it or not, while I consider you one of my larger clients, from a system size, there are a lot of the AAAs are much larger. And, you know, it is true in the utilities world, bigger is better. You can pass a lot of the cost and spread them out a lot better when you have a bigger base, if you will. I'm struggling with that down in the south part of the state in a couple different places that are growing, need to do a big reservoir, only have a couple thousand connections, and their general funds end up having to, these are county enterprise funds, end up having to help. So that is something that it shouldn't be passed over, but the size does help. And so again, as you noted, Fitch talked about, they still are concerned and want to make sure that we stay within our goals and our policies there. All right, so now looking toward the historically, you know, I know from the years that we've been doing this that we've always tried to get down to that lower limit, the 200%, two times goal there, which is that tan line. But it seems like every time we look at the historical side, it's like, well, but we're well below our even upper limit. And that all has to do, of course, with our assumptions, or that we're not going to grow as fast as we end up growing. And so the merry-go-round hasn't stopped yet, but at some point it could. And we want to make sure we're sitting in a seat, not sitting on the ground from a strength standpoint. Coverage is very similar in that regard, in that we're well above our target. But of course, this is just the 1.5 coverage that includes availability, which is, as I mentioned earlier, very, very strong. So when we take away the availability charges, you'll see that drops a pretty good bit. In previous years, we haven't been as strong, but it's now really starting to pop up there. And part of that is I think a little bit of that is just the additional growth you've had, revenues that have been growing stronger. And then also you've been able to really keep a good eye on expenditures, operating expenditures. So from an assumption standpoint, again, we really tried to utilize the most current rate study. We did take into account, of course, the increases that you adopted and then the projections beyond that. So those are all in line with what Stantec put together. From an ERC connection growth standpoint, we're using a 2020 projection in 25, and then you'll see the numbers there at the bottom right corner, 2,100, 2,200, and then back down to basically 2,000 after that. Again, we saw a drop post-COVID in 22 and 23 to around those numbers. And these projected numbers are basically in line with some of the county estimates and things that we've seen for the planning area.
Can I comment on that real quick? One of my colleagues here, but just, you know, that's such a remarkable change as we look forward compared to what we saw last year. But, you know, just looking at the ERCs so far this year, only 4% of them have come from single family development, which has historically been a major source of revenue and major source of growth. 76% so far this year is data center. And we know that the county's trying to prohibit by right data center. And so it seems to me, as I look at this is telling that story of no more data centers by right. So you have a substantial decrease in that revenue source. And then we've already seen for years, the single family development, much less than it's been in past decades. And multifamily is still a tough product type in Loudoun County. People who are doing multifamily are mostly doing Arlington and sort of if they're going to be in condos and apartments. So I think it's reasonable from my perspective, this projection that we're seeing here of much lower ERCs moving forward seems to mesh with that background, just from my own perspective. And you guys can add in or tell me what I'm
No,
missing, but
that's a great point. I was actually, right before we were about to turn the page, was going to say, the reason that we saw that spike is a lot of the catch up from some of the data centers, not even just the new data centers, it's new data centers, but it's on top of that, catch up from previous data centers who basically said, we were going to use X, but now we're using X plus. And so you saw a bump, not only from just normal growth, but also from previous years. And of course, if you go back 3 years ago, I would argue that we didn't even think about connection fees from data centers being in our goals, but we knew we were starting to see slowdowns on the residential side. And that has continued, of course, as you mentioned. So anything else you want to add?
It's a good point, Brendan. Maybe you or Charles can answer this question. I remember a few years ago when Metro was coming, it was talk about transit-oriented development and, doing a lot of residential multifamily around the metro stations, and COVID happened, and I think that got put to the side. Is that still somewhere being discussed, or is that just dead?
well, I mean, Charles can weigh in too, but I mean, Moorfield and Silver District West are the only two big projects there at the Ashburn Metro Station. Moorfield's been approved a long time, and they're actively developing that. And Silver District West is new. And slowly they've been selling off pieces. Brambleton Group's been developing Silver District West. But multifamily is just not single family development in Loudoun. Loudoun's a bedroom community. People don't move to Loudoun to live in a condo. If you want to live in a condo, I live in Georgetown or Arlington or something like this.
I would share on that as well. And I think I've got a really good visual example too. Like as you come down the toll road and you see the development at Wheelie and really the urban form and the mixture of uses and higher density. When you come into Loudoun, you've got their transit center planning, innovation station on the Loudoun County side. And even right north of the airport, that's primarily data center development. There was a push to keep that plan for employment type uses. But the Loudoun board is interested in urban transit style development, a mixture of uses. That area is impacted by the airport overlay. And then you get out to the Ashburn Station area, and the market for multi-story county's plan is like, at least 93 feet in height or 90 feet in height. The market really isn't there to support that type of development, but you can see it is maybe a few miles just to the east. So I think it's a waiting game, and preserving those long-term goals for urban style transit node development is super important to the county, but I think it's probably a number of years out in order to get there.
Okay, thank you.
So kind of along those lines, one thing that we started doing a couple of years ago was looking at the impact of data centers on availability fees. And so we attempted here to kind of give you a sense of what might happen should it fall off. So basically from 2024, approximately 67% of the availability charges came from data centers in the service area. And since 2019, approximately 47% have come from data centers. And so using that, we just tried to take an impact and look at what it might have on the model should it dry up. And so you can see on the bottom left corner, we've projected our cash balances. The dark is with and the light green is without. And I can tell you, because I was looking back and forth, the dark green is projected worth the 200%. So we'd be below our 200% without the data centers in terms of projected cash balances. And what that would mean would be that we'd end up having to bring in more debt, which of course puts more pressure on our coverage. And you can see that on the right side, how while in terms of at least meeting our coverage, it'd be okay. If we did bring more debt in for making up, again, trying to balance out the two, if we bring in more debt to balance out the cash, it would put a little bit of pressure again on that projected debt coverage.
Question, can you just explain how the without was modeled or derived, or to get, each year you've got cash balance and debt service with and without. So without is based on what?
Less. So what we
Zero
did
or-
was less. Well, we used the percentages up there. We just said, okay, if we bring it down. Oh yeah, zero. I'm sorry. Yes, I see your question. Yeah, 0 data centers. Yes. So this
Okay.
was all assuming the 2000-ish were basically all, homes basically coming in that we didn't have the additional push of the data centers.
Okay, so just to kind of add another perspective on that, like another look at it through another lens, is the ability to locate a data center post 2020, let's say 2026, 27-ish. The supply of available industrial planned and zoned land is very scarce. The regulatory ability, the ability to get through the regulatory process locally is very, very, very difficult. A change in planned land use would be a driver to open up more area for data center, but that doesn't seem likely on the horizon. So not only do you have that very significant limitation on expansion of new data center development, you also have constraints on existing data centers and their ability to expand their existing footprint. So I think you're probably right on it.
Yeah.
Because the growth probably won't be there. So anyway.
Yeah, no, and I'll just point out the note at the very bottom. So what we did was we basically cut our future availability charges by 45.6, which is that roughly that 47% drop. So essentially we assumed fewer than 2,000 is a better way to say it. So we assumed that we didn't get that full 2,000 new connections. So maybe it's harsh the way we did it, because maybe you do get homes, no data centers at 2,000 new connections on average using that 5/8 number. So maybe, maybe it's somewhere in between. Just it's hard to know exactly. We try to do our best at projecting it.
Do you look at the county's residential lot inventory?
We didn't. We relied basically on the planning numbers that
Okay.
have been put out by the county, rather than go back and try to redo what they've done.
That's the number that I've found most interesting. It's the number of lots that have been approved but not yet
Not yet
built.
built.
And
Yeah.
when you graph that out, that it takes so long, kind of what Charles said,
Yeah.
the regulatory environment takes so long to get lots approved, that it's not something that happens quickly. And the lot inventory in Loudoun County is at an all-time low for townhouses and single-family detached. It has gone down, 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 down for the last 15 years. You can just track it. And those aren't projections. Those are the real numbers. The planning numbers are projections, because when you really get into a piece of land, you go, okay, this is planned for this many number of homes. Oh, but it's got floodplain and it's got, the small world Pagonia and it's got this and it's got that. And, you can't build the planning numbers and, anyhow, so.
They're not as clean as they used to be, it sounds like.
No,
Yeah.
and it's hard. I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's meant to be a broad brush. And so in
Sure.
that sense, it's useful. But the real numbers, at least from my perspective, that tell the story is the number of lots that remain to be built. And it's an all-time low. Loudoun's got an all-time low.
Well, and I can say from the county side and working with them each year as we do their bond issues, that's the feeling I've gotten, is that it's just starting to be smaller and smaller, the area that they have. And we usually use maps when we're talking to the agencies on the county side, and we're showing them kind of how it's pushing out toward that 15 corridor, and how all of a sudden you're starting to run out of areas that they want to have building in.
Right.
So until that changes, yeah, there's going to be I think, big picture, I think we're all saying the same thing is I feel like the conservative nature of what we're doing for the future projections is the way to go.
I think
Based
so.
on everything we're seeing and what I'm hearing from you all who live here and live it each day. So
I think that's right.
Courtney, Mr. Allen has a question.
shoot.
Thank you, Jewel. You know, along what Charles and Brent were saying, can't we better accurately forecast the data centers? I mean, shouldn't we be able to see ones that are in the permitting process, ones that have been approved? Yeah, I would think we would know in the next 1 or 2 years pretty definitively, based on that, how many are going to be approved. Am I off on that? And if that's true, we could get pretty accurate numbers, and then maybe be the outlying years 3, 4, and 5 where we could, there would be more ambiguity. But I would think there would be clarity if we dug deeper, estimating those numbers than we're doing now. It seems like we're just rolling the dice every time.
We have developed a draft BI reporting tool that takes into account exactly what you said, Mr. Allen. So working with we and land development, we've put time periods in, you know, how long does it take to get through the review process? So we have that. We just haven't refined it yet. So we haven't shared it, right? We kind of need some data in there to see how we're doing. And as for the next year, we do actually have, I can show you the list of the 10 that we forecasted to come in for 2025. So 1 year out, we're pretty solid. 2 years out, 3 years out, we're developing this draft model. It's just going to take some time till we get our assumptions correct, I guess is the right word.
I mean that's great, because so much of what we do is trying to guess what the data center revenue number is going to be. So having some clarity around that will just help us forecast better.
It's a good question, Terry. I was kind of thinking along the same line. It's more of a hill. It's not a cliff. It doesn't just fall off all of a sudden in 1 year and then that's it. It's gradually, it's got to be prior approved, or some going through the regulatory process, that something's going to happen over the next 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, we should be able to forecast in the next year, 95% accuracy, I would think. And then maybe year 2 is 80%. And then beyond that, like Sally said, it gets more nebulous, but still we should have clarity on the next 2 years.
And we did say that, right? Like, I'm solid. When I come in here at budget, I'm like, okay, I got my data. That's what's gonna happen. And you have seen what's happened with
Yeah.
the expansions that weren't even in our forecast from existing data centers. And then the rollover this year that happened. So best guesses aren't always accurate either. So.
And then, since I seem to have the floor, I'm going to ask the other question I had right now, and I don't know whether it's going to be addressed in a future slide. But when I look at last year's 5-year plan of financing, which we did in the spring of 2024, we were forecasting 110 million in borrowing, 80 in 26, and 30 million in 28. This year we're forecasting 200 million, so it's gone up 90 million, and this is a really general question, and there probably is some nuances I'm missing, but we did have a $42 million windfall from the power lines. And we did have, I'm guessing, a $20 million windfall from ERCs that we weren't really anticipating. And then we have the 7% rate increases, which I know is just a catch up for expenses. So that's probably not appropriate to include that. But I'm looking at 60 million probably in unanticipated revenue. So I'm just wondering why our borrowing number went up. I know the CIP went up. I get that, but I would have thought that it would not have been the 200 million number. Are we just padding it? Are we just trying to be super conservative?
Mr. Allen, I would say that as the years on the 5-year plan continue to go out further, 29, 30, you're starting to see the Broad Run Phase 3 construction costs move into the window more, that you weren't seeing last year. But again, those were all included in the rate study themselves. So that's why the 200 million borrowing that Mr. Rogers is showing is still in line with what was projected in the rate study. So it is a big jump from last year's 5-year plan to this year's 5-year plan, but it was in our 10-year window and has been planned for in your rate study and anticipated going forward in the 5-year plan. I don't know if that helps, but
A little.
So along those lines, and on the next slide, we talk about the capital plan comparison, and what you'll see is, I guess, I was thinking we would see a bigger jump in 29, but as you'll see is there's a pretty good jump in 27 and 28. And I guess some of that is just project costs that have either moved up a little faster or have come in a lot higher than maybe was initially projected when we looked at this a year ago, especially for the 27, 28, which would have been at the end of last year's CIP. So we've gone from 780 million to almost $1 billion in terms of the next 5 years in terms of the capital plan. And with that being basically a $200 million jump, as it's not a 1-for-1 or anything like that. It just so happened that the increase was roughly 100 million more in debt than, which is roughly half that increase. It's because, again, it's all put into the model and it's not like it's a 1-for-1 anywhere. So it's just the way that kind of the numbers shook out. Page 26 here, the capital funding sources. I think the one thing that I'll point out as I've worked with other utilities is that your cash levels are much more, it's just a lot higher than most. 76, almost 77% of your CIP being cash is fantastic. It means you're able to take those availability fees, availability charges, and put them back into the capital plan. And this is one of those that it's hard if you don't see others. You kind of take this for granted, but it really is a strong capital funding program in that you're not borrowing 50% like I might see at another utility. You're actually only borrowing, in this case, we're looking at 20%, which is tiny compared to most. So that's one thing that hopefully will give you some comfort.
Is that written into the report, that statement you just made?
It's not.
That's a very, very
Yeah.
telling statement.
Yeah, it's not. That's just it's an observation. As I was going back through this, I was like, it's something I wanted to make sure I mentioned to you all to give you some comfort that it is a very, very strong number, that type of being able to pay cash for much of your CIP. And part of that's the planning we've been doing over the years. The board has stayed steadfast with the policies that we put in place many, many years ago, the 2 to 3 times. It's been in, I don't remember what year, but it's been in place a long time. And I'll probably even before I was have been working with you all, which goes back into the early 90s. So this is what the projected debt service looks like as we project out. Again, the new issuances that are shown in the colors other than the dark green. The dark green is existing debt. You can see as it goes up a little bit over the next couple of years and then flattens out, and then you see a drop in 2030, and then so on as some of the older issuances fall off from previous projects, previous 30-year amortizations. And so while we didn't try to get too cute with maybe delaying principal for a year, such as in 2029, which is probably what we would do if we do get to that point in our issuing debt, so that we don't see a spike like that. We simply just layered it on just to see what it would look like at this point.
So are these bonds self-amortizing or?
They're what we call level debt service, similar to what you would do for a home mortgage where you're paying a level payment each year. So it's more interest up front, and over time you pay more principal as you go toward the back. So
And by the
if
time
that's
the
what you-
bond's done, the principal's all paid back,
Exactly.
interest.
Yeah,
Okay.
the last payment is much more principal, very little interest.
Sure.
The very beginning, it's more interest and very little principal.
But at the end, there's no balloon payment, there's no.
No, sir. Oh, correct. No, it's all what we call level payments. Correct. Yep.
Great.
And it's all fixed, meaning when we go to the market, we don't do variable rate debt.
Yep. Oh,
It's
that's great.
basically, we fix it and we're done. Now, we may be able to come back and refinance like we did before at the right times, but we don't we're not playing an interest rate game.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
That's important.
I'd like to get some of those rates like we had 2 years ago.
Yeah, I think we are, especially if you're out in the car market right now. Crazy.
I was speaking about
Well, and I understand, yeah, and I will say, I remember when we celebrated under 4% interest rates, which is where we are, right now. If we were to go out and borrow today, I think we'd be right around the 4%. And so we're not in that bad of a environment right now, but anyway,
So 4% tax.
tax-free, yes, sir, tax exempt, correct. So projected cash, as we look at, again, as we set the plan up, our goal is at the end of the 5 years to be right on our policy. That's to kind of give you a sense, the variable here is really the bond issues. Those move up and down to try to get those numbers in 27, 28, and 29 to be right at that number, as you can see graphically. And so to the extent, again, we end up with more availability dollars than we're projecting that come in 25 the rest of this year, or 26 and 27, then we will basically not borrow as much starting in 27. So I suspect if things keep going that, that 70 million might be only, half that or some number, depending upon, again, it depends upon the dollars we see over the next year and a half. And it might be that we might be able to push that issue out another year. And so instead of doing it all in 27, we do it all in 28, or those 2 years. So that'll be something that we'll tweak next year and then the next year as we get a little bit closer to those timeframes. And of course, the project, depending upon how fast or slow the projects are coming or going, will also affect what we see a year from now. I mentioned early on, we were going to talk about some of the peer comparisons, just to give you a sense of where they are. A lot of these are in the Southeast. As you can see, there's we've got one out in the West, but this gives you a sense of those medians. So in addition, we have included AAAs from S&P and Fitch, and we do have some AA1 medians from Moody's mixed in there as well. So from the standpoint of the medians are there in the orange at the top. It's kind of their median of all of their AAA utilities, as well as S&P and Fitch's. You can see where you stand in 24, and we also projected out for 29. And then you can see in dark green the current folks. So I would say when you look at this one, which is of course coverage, we're very strong right now. We're not at the very top, but we're pretty close. With where we're projecting out in 29, we'd be right in the middle of that pack. So some a little bit weaker than us, and then a few stronger than us.
You guys do any work out in Oklahoma?
I don't.
I know some of those guys in Oklahoma City, and it's an interesting
Is it?
situation they have going on there.
No, it's funny. When I was looking at the map, I was like, Oklahoma, I didn't even know there's a AAA out there. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I know, worked with a few around the Southeast, but. Yeah. Okay, so looking at page 32 now on terms of, I'm sorry, I failed to mention that was the including availability. So this is now excluding. So when we exclude, of course, when we look at this group, we're much tighter toward the bottom of that group. So again, that's why it's important to keep our eyes on that particular metric of what our projections are. Days cash on hand. Of course, this is the idea behind this is, if revenues just stopped, how many days could you operate the system, continuing to operate, paying your debt service, paying your O&M? How many days could you last? For those of you who may have seen the headlines in early January with my home of City of Richmond, where they had no water for 5 days, you start thinking about, this is why we do that. Because as I mentioned, I worked with them directly, have had for many years. And on day 3, I got a phone call from S&P. Hey, we saw this in the news. How you doing down there?
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, as it would happen, she said, you're not in my top 10 of problems this week because the fires in California were going on. And so it got to me to thinking, at least we don't have those issues here, but imagine that being your utility and having no connections for how long, who knows how, not connections, but how people actually using water for how long. I mean, it's going to take years for those to rebuild up. So we take for granted, and the rating agencies do, sometimes we think, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this for the rating? Why are the rating agencies pushing us so hard? there's a good example, because out there in California, those utilities are going to be really, it's going to be an interesting time to see what's happening, just with those guys. So obviously, we hope that'll never happen here, and we don't anticipate it would, but that's one of the reasons why we do have the cash that we need, particularly if growth slowed down here. You still have a few things in your CIP that you would have to complete in order to take care of those that are here. And so we want to make sure we've got enough cash to take care of that.
Courtney, with utilities, is there such a thing as business interruption insurance with utilities? Is that possible with a
I
utility?
imagine there might be. It's not my world, but no, I don't know.
Yeah.
Not-
Yeah, I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
I don't know.
Utility.
That's a very good question, though. So the postscript to Richmond is I'll be in New York on Friday. I'm going to update with the mayor. So we'll see how that goes. So with that, happy to answer other questions.
I think I've got a question underneath a observation, so just bear with me. Our role here, I think, or at least what I bring to the conversation, when I want to make sure that we're doing for the organization is looking out to the future and doing everything we can to be prepared for decisions that we have to make. And so there's always a lot of unknowns. We're not quite sure what the big challenge will be at the next few years, globally or what that means locally. But we do have all these indicators, and the 5-year plan of finance should be a good benchmark for us to say, okay, we need to be ready to make some decisions. I think understanding debt service and recognizing that it's cumulative, like you may have years where you are serving the debt of prior years and it's approaching retirement, added on to issuance that happened more recently. And so if you look at 2029, it's our high point of, old debt, new debt type of combination. So understanding that we're looking at the relationship of what happens with availability charges, what does it look like without, adjusted, whatever happens, I think we are going to see less of the availability charge, large chunk that we've been seeing. I think that's going to happen. And if you think about it's almost mid 2025 for that spike in projects that are going to come through the approval process. Probably that would be 27 or about 27. So coming down into 29, you're approaching a low period. So my observation is, this is not the CIP committee, but if you read the packet for tomorrow, there's a lot of discussion about CIP projects. And maybe we have to be just a little bit more tight on that to roll out. Are these projects really necessary to roll out at this time? We have the discussion explanation. Sounds great. Do it. But what are we doing to really safeguard against too much too soon? And so that's what I'm a little bit, what I'm observing. And I think a little bit of caution is probably necessary. When I have attended the CIP committee, my impression of that is there's a explanation of the project and a relationship tied back to overall planning strategy and the need for it, and then roll it out. Let's go forward. But maybe not so much is how I feel at this point, weighing all of the good stuff that you guys provide to us. This is a 5-year plan, and we're supposed to learn from it. It's supposed to guide our decisions. I think what I'm learning is maybe a little bit more caution on CIP spending. Okay, so the question is, and sorry about that. Long way to get to the question. We came off of the rate study, and one of the largest justifications was not just capital cost and our 1.5 billion CIP, but cost escalation. So in today's discussion, we heard a lot about the cost of money and the cost of financing. But how is cost escalation factored into this outlook? Because we were hearing about power, we were hearing about bulk purchase, DC Water and Fairfax. We were hearing about chemicals. And so everybody experienced cost escalation in the last few years. Where's the cost escalation influence in this presentation?
That's was factored into our rates. So every year had, and in the past it was 3% across the board. This year it's more 5%. And then we did actually do higher increases on those categories that we were talking about. So that's factored into our rates.
That's factored into our rate, but where is it in this 5-year plan? The influence of these things on cost escalation? Is it
Are you talking about capital or operations?
I'm talking about well, let me reset my question. In the presentation, we learned that 100% of debt service and 30% of principal is covered by user rates.
Right.
Okay, so we learned from user rates that user rates built in and were inclusive of everything we needed to do. And I think that's some operating and capital influencing that.
Mostly
So-
operating for our use.
So I just didn't see the influence of cost escalation in this discussion.
So in the appendix, hopefully this helps. In the appendix on page 37 is the actual model
Okay.
that Davenport uses. And so they take our actuals from 2024 and then our approved 2025 budget. And then the outer years, they update every year, but it's coming from the rate study. So these projections are including those cost escalations that were from the prior years.
Okay.
Mhm. And so then that's where they come up with how much debt we need to borrow going forward and all of that. So I think the cost escalation it's in these numbers.
So it's operational cost estimates are built into the operational expenditure lines that basically Stantec used as well.
Thank you.
Jim, you had a question?
Yes, I do, and it follows on yours. I thought you were going the place I was. I've spent 10 years on the CIP committee here, and we planned a lot of projects and a lot of great work goes into it. But when I read this over the weekend, I was in a different time zone, so if I have a different modality, and the two models, in the appendix, I have concerns at 28 and 29 about our ability to move forward with those projects. However, then when I look at some of those projects, they tend to extend, which means our payments are further out. But I have concerns about the scope of our projects, the scope of anticipated environmental requirements that we're going to have to meet. So I have some concerns. So I'll bring those up with the CIP committee and the full board that maybe we need to be cautious. And I don't know if that's what you're saying, but I think we need to be cautious looking in the out years. Do you agree?
Yes, and I would say that's why we do these things annually, and so we can keep bringing these things forward to you. I think the hard part is a lot of these capital projects that are big dollars are ones that we can't change, like the Broad Run expansion. We have to do that.
Yeah.
The ammonia removal project, again, what you're saying, that's a regulation. We have to do that. Are there things we can delay? Yes. And I think when we start to get towards that 29 and we start looking at that's a big number. And we do that every year. We look at it and we say, okay, we have an R&R program. We want to replace water and sewer lines
We have to.
as they age. But when we get to that time, okay, we need to borrow $80 million. Do we really need to do $10 million worth of sewer line replacements this year? probably not. Maybe we can push it. So I think it's an annual thing that we can keep bringing up to you, but I don't think there's one just big, magic project that we can take out that's going to substantially reduce our CIP spend in the next 10 years,
But there are
unfortunately.
other things that we can look at, our supply chain.
Yes.
Long-term purchases of,
Mhm.
solutions that we need. I don't know if there's much we can do about rock and concrete, but that's a big expense. So,
Yeah, and I think, to Kendra and Alton's credit, that's one of the things they're doing with Broad Run Phase 3. Like they already bought one of the big pieces of equipment to try to get ahead of that. So they are
Yep.
thinking about these
Yeah.
things.
This is the stuff, and that's why I really like this plan.
Yeah.
And it does combine, and that's why I'd like to come to the finance committee. And well, some people come to the CIP committee regularly too.
Yeah, actually, just if I may, I wanted to kind of add to what Brian was saying. I wanted to begin by, I absolutely think there's validity to Mr. Yudd's observation. It's something that we should not take lightly, and we will continue to look at, as Brian mentioned. But, I think, and I also wanted to echo, the cadence at which we update the capital plan annually and come and look at the 5-year plan and update those numbers at that cadence. I think it's very important. It has been important to our past success. But the organization, from a planning and project execution perspective, we've always sought to be ready to serve and ready to move in lockstep with the county and the local economy here. And it is about striking that right balance. And for these large projects, I think what we saw with Broad Run Phase 2 was an attempt to, absolutely right size that project and deliver just the amount of capacity that we needed. And then we got the curveball and we had to react. And we've seen where, okay, this has actually become a just-in-time delivery of that program in terms of sewer capacity. And so moving forward into Phase 3, we said, okay, we probably ought to give ourselves a capacity buffer here. That doesn't introduce a risk, and it is a very costly program. But then we stepped back from that and we sought to break that program into packages that could deliver parts of the capacity and parts of the plant where we need it at the time we need it. And so it gives us a lot of levers to move along the way that I do think help hit it what Mr. Yudd was suggesting. So I know that was a very long-winded way of explaining it from a different perspective, but I just want to close by saying I do think as we bring forward projects to the CIP committee and as the years go on, we really are going to probably put some more scrutiny on things.
One other thing I'd like to bring up and compliment the authority over the years on this is being opportunistic to refinance at the time. That's not really here, but over the years that has saved a lot of money. You can't factor that in, but it is something that we can drive it ourselves and look for opportunities for cost savings. So that's helps to offset some of these potential increases as well.
I remember when we had looked at this issue maybe 2 years ago when we were looking at the costs of expansion and such. And Mr. Allen, you'll remember you had asked some questions around this, but part of being conservative is having a capacity buffer so that when the Board of Supervisors says, hey, we just did this deal with whoever or whatever, or we just changed policy and now we want you to serve the JLMA, that we're not in a position of going, well, we'll have capacity for that in the next 6 years after we build another expansion on the plant or something like this. And when we had looked at capacity, we don't have a ton of margin currently, and we can't buy more from DC Water because they've tapped out. And so Loudoun's ability to serve its future is really dependent on ourselves. We're not going to be able to lean into our neighboring jurisdictions like we have in times past. And then you have PFAS and these kinds of things happening as well with regulations and so forth. And I think we had an analysis, you guys had some kind of graph where we had the amount of water that we can produce through Trap Rock and then the amount of sewage we can handle through Broad Run. And we were at a narrow margin there, narrower than we were comfortable with. And we said, we really need to increase capacity there so that we can make full use of our water capacity. which we've already invested a lot of money in and so forth. And so it is a tough thing, but I don't know that there's really any obvious detour from the path we're on. But it is a little uncomfortable. I looked at the number of homes that we have. So this is real numbers from Department of Planning and Zoning. They do this every July, once a year. And so our most current numbers from 2024, we've got 2,020 single-family detached lots remaining in the county. That's over the entire county, all the districts.
Not just the ones we service.
Correct. That's the entire county. That's all of Western Loudoun, that's Eastern Loudoun, that's the whole thing. You got 2,020. And then you got 3,283, that's single-family attached. So just to put that in perspective, there's 150,000 homes in Loudoun County as of 2023, rough numbers, 150,000. So if we built every single family and single family attached lot that's approved in the county, you would add 3.5% to the total supply. If you built every single lot that's in the single family, it works out to 1.35%. That's the number of lots as a percentage of the total that we have in the county. You'd increase it 1.3, and the townhouses, you'd increase 2.1. So if you combine the two, it's like 3.5. But that's if we built every single lot, which we're not about to do. But it's just very small. But
How about multifamily?
multifamily's gone up quite a bit. But that gets back to like, remember, Concora was approved like 10 years ago, and they're only just now starting to build some of the condominiums and things over the last year, 2, 3, something like that. But, Reston Town Center was approved decades before they built that stuff. It's not a product type that has a good market in Loudoun County. We're just too far from DC and all the amenities out there.
How does the Western Loudoun figure into that, since most of that is well in septic?
I mean, Western Loudoun's future is to look like Great Falls.
Bigger ones.
Big, expensive houses on big lots with drain fields and wells with no services and no amenities. And you'll have like Georgetown Pike will be Route 9, and it already is. It's worse than Georgetown Pike, but traffic was bad on Berlin Turnpike 20 years ago.
Oh, I
My
know.
wife and I lived up there, and we're like, we're not living up. This is 20 years ago. So, that's the future of Western Loudoun. Unfortunately, it's not a good plan. All the growth, Western Loudoun still gets all the traffic.
Yeah.
Because everybody has to live further west.
Further west, it
So
comes down from Maryland and West Virginia.
Yeah, you get the cars no matter what. That's one of the
Yeah.
big objections to new growth. We don't want more traffic. Well, you get the traffic one way or another.
You got it anyway, yeah.
And so unfortunately, it's not a good look into the future, but that's what it is at the moment.
Thank you for those numbers.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Mr. Chairman, I want to have
And
one
then-
last, just thinking, one point to think about. So Mr. Rudd brought this up and it made me thinking about it. Way back in the early part of the presentation, we talked about user rates covering 100% interest and 30% of principal. As this utility starts to age in a good way and the growth starts to fall off, that 30% is going to have to rise, because we won't have as many connection fees, availability fees available to pay that debt service. So that 30% is going to one day go to 35, which will one day go to 40, and so on and so on. And that's going to, and when do we do that? There's no industry standard. We don't really know. I think we'll see it when we start seeing the coverage starting to fall, especially the one without availability fees, or with availability fees, sorry. And so just want to put that, hey, that's something that we'll need to think about at some point
That's up here.
as we hit that plateau and start falling down that hill.
Right.
Coming down that hill, so
Good.
fall.
You worked with other utilities that didn't plan for that, and
You've got a great plan for that.
Yeah.
You've been planning for that, and that's why that cushion is important. And one day we'll come to you, or someone will come to you and say, that policy probably needs to now go down from 200 to 150, or then one day down maybe to 100. Because we're not growing like we used to be.
That's right.
Don't know when that's going to be. That could be a while. And we didn't foresee
Right.
data centers. Well, we might already be there, right? But
That's
the data
true.
centers have added a huge injection
Right.
of cash
but
that
they're gonna.
we
they're
didn't
gonna
see
do-
5 years ago when we did this plan.
Courtney, Mr. Allen has a question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add to what everyone's saying. I know I'm going to be a little bit redundant, but there is going to be some Great timing for that. There is, excuse me, there is going to be some kind of threading the needle as we transition from, this growth phase, like you just mentioned, to a mature utility where, user rates are the ones footing the bill for operation maintenance and things like that. But what to sum up what Charles' concerns are and what Brett's reality is that I think a lot falls on, Alton and Kendra to really manage these projects because we have to have them very efficiently and really kind of be stewards of the nice capital cushion that the data centers have provided over the past several years. And we have that nest egg, so to speak, to get a lot of these projects going. And we just need to manage them very, very well and hope that as we wrap up these projects, we're at the point where, it's going to be threading the needle. Our debt service in 2029 is probably going to be the highest. And at that point, we don't want to have huge capital projects after that. We want to be cresting the hill and coming down on those. So it's really going to be a challenge, I think, over the next 4 or 5 years to manage all these projects and make sure that the timing is right. So that's my little pep talk, so to speak.
One last thing I'd like to add too is, as we're thinking about aging, is that in my experience working with utilities, most don't fund depreciation. What I mean by that is we're putting money into a lot of new plants and things like that right now. You have a 3R program.
Mhm.
We got to keep an eye on that 3R program. That's where these guys come important, making sure that they're putting the dollars into the budget to pay for that. Because if you don't have the money for that, guess where it comes from? Rates and charges. And guess where that comes from? Probably going to borrow for it. I would say 90% of our clients have to borrow to go and renovate a plant or pay for some of those new pipes that have aged because they didn't plan for the depreciation side of things. One of the few that does, Cobb County, Marietta, one of our clients down in Georgia, they're one of the few places, they're a wholesaler that they actually charge everyone for depreciation. They don't do a lot of borrowing. We actually do more investment management for them than we do borrowing. And so I wanted to bring that up because we're at that point where we probably just need to think about that. And it's important to make sure that 3R program is covering everything and we're not just pushing things off. And I think you guys do a great job of planning. I just want to throw that out there because it is an observation that unfortunately we see places that have to go out and borrow. I mean, Richmond right now, if it has to go out and fix something, they have to go borrow for it. That's why the CSO program is so expensive. Because they're having to go out and borrow for all that.
Some percentage of our repair and replacement and all that is baked in currently, but it's not a
Yes.
big percentage.
It's 70%.
Oh, it's 70%.
Yeah,
We
so
talked about this like a year ago. or something, I
yeah,
think.
it's not an official board approved goal, but the goal in your rate study is to fund 50% of depreciation. The last rate study, it was getting close to 70% of
Yeah.
depreciation.
I remember
So-
we were talking about, I said, why not 100?
Yes, yes,
We
yeah.
were like looking at what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So hopefully that's helpful.
No, that is. Thank you.
Any other questions?
No, really appreciate you coming up and walking through all
Yeah,
that.
it's a great presentation, Corey. Well done. This is good report. Appreciate answering our questions as well. Yeah. More questions, and I'll make the motion to recommend the committee endorse the 5-year plan of finance as presented and forward to the board for approval in April. Second?
Seconded.
Okay, any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Good. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, do you want that on action or?
Yeah, I think it's gonna be on action. Yeah, the board has to approve it, so, yeah. Okay. Good discussion. All right, Sally, our monthly update.
Quick update on February financials. Our operating revenues totaled 21.6 million, which is above our forecast of 19.9 million. Non-operating revenues are also ahead of budget. And that was because of the rollover of the data centers that happened. Expenses are, thank you. Okay. Expenses are under forecast. You'll see here contractual services is a little higher than budget, but that's timing. That will catch up in March. That was some of our DC water charges that we got. Here is our ERCs. So as of February, we had 123. I did back out. So if we backed out those, the surprise ones, not surprise, the ones that rolled into January, we were at 464 versus 337 budget. So still slightly ahead, but more in line of where budget would be. And there are the percentages that Mr. Campbell talked about, 76% year-to-date data centers. Next category is multifamily here, that's come on. And then our CIP plan, we have spent 10 million out of our forecasted 12 million, so that's 86%. And then of that 6 million that was spent in February, approximately 450,000 was funded by user rates and the rest was funded by availability fees. And cumulatively, that's where we are year to date. And still draft because we haven't finalized audit, so keep that in mind, but it shouldn't change too much. Any questions?
No questions. Terry, do you have any questions? Okay. Anything else for today? No.
That was
Okay.
it.
Motion to adjourn. Sorry. I'll make the motion to adjourn.
I will second
All
it.
right, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Terry.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everybody.